Bethlehem, near the end of the 4th century. A limestone cave beneath a monastery, lit by a single oil lamp. An old scholar named Jerome sits hunched over a table covered in scrolls, his eyes moving between two languages at once. Hebrew on one side, Latin taking shape on the other. He has already spent years on this project, translating the entire Hebrew Bible into Latin, word by exhausting word, for a church that reads almost nothing else. Tonight he's stuck on a single line from the prophet Isaiah. The Hebrew word appears here and nowhere else in the entire Old Testament, used exactly once, describing a king brought down from glory. Jerome needs a Latin word for it. He reaches for the same term Roman poets already used for the planet Venus, blazing before sunrise. He writes it in lowercase, the way you'd write any ordinary noun. He has no idea that this single word choice, made by candlelight, on one line, in one manuscript, is about to outlive the empire he's translating for, and eventually get attached to a name almost nobody in this cave would recognize. To understand what Jerome was translating, we have to leave that cave and go back almost 1,000 years before he ever picked up a pen. The prophet is Isaiah, and the century is the 8th before Christ. Judah is a small kingdom trying to survive in the shadow of empires it cannot control. To the north, Assyria is tightening its grip on the region, and within a lifetime it will erase Israel's sister kingdom from the map entirely. Judah watches, and waits, and wonders whose turn is next. But the passage we're chasing doesn't name Assyria. It names Babylon, the empire that, within another century, will finish what Assyria started, and do it to Judah directly. Babylon's armies will surround Jerusalem, break its walls, burn its temple, and drag its king out in chains. For the generation that lives through it, Babylon isn't a word in a history book. It's the thing that ended everything they knew. Many scholars place the final shaping of this particular oracle in the era when Babylon itself, not Assyria, has become the dominant threat, during or after the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, the king who destroyed Jerusalem's temple in 586 BC and carried away its people. That dating is not settled with certainty, and honest scholarship treats it as an open question rather than a fixed fact. But the target the poem names is unmistakable either way, an empire whose armies had already humiliated Judah, or was about to. So when the prophetic tradition connected to Isaiah imagines a future moment, a moment after the exile, after the humiliation, when Judah is free again, it imagines something specific, not just relief, reversal, a taunt song. Ancient cultures had a recognized poetic form for this, the mashal, sung about a tyrant who has finally fallen, the way people still mock a bully once he's no longer standing over them. Judah's audience would have recognized the form the moment the poem began. That's the genre we're stepping into. Isaiah chapter 14 opens by telling us exactly this, in plain prose, before a single line of poetry appears, that one day Israel will take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, not a demon, not a fallen angel. A king, named, specific, historical, about to be mocked in verse, the way ancient poets mocked emperors who overreached. And it's inside that mocking poem, aimed at a human throne, that 4 Hebrew words appear, which will end up traveling further than anyone in Isaiah's audience could have imagined. Helel ben shachar. Most people who know this passage have never actually read the verse that comes just before it. 4 lines earlier, the text tells us plainly what we're about to hear. Not a riddle, not a hidden code that took centuries to crack. A caption printed at the top of the page telling the original audience exactly who they were about to hear mocked. If the target is that clear, though, we still have to ask what the poem actually says about him, because the language it reaches for next is stranger and older than almost anyone expects. There's a reason a poem mocking a king would reach for astral, starlit language in the first place. Across the ancient Near East, kings routinely described their own glory in exactly these terms, claiming a status that brushed up against the divine, comparing their thrones to the heavens, their reigns to the permanence of the stars. This wasn't considered outrageous self-praise in the royal courts of Isaiah's world. It was standard political theater, the ancient equivalent of a ruler minting coins with his own face haloed like a god. Isaiah's poem doesn't invent that kind of boast for its Babylonian target. It borrows the very language kings used about themselves and turns it back on him as an accusation. The greater the claimed height, the poem argues, the harder the fall. Somewhere in the middle of the taunt, the poem chooses a specific word to describe this king's former glory. How you are fallen from heaven, O helel, son of the dawn. That word, helel, appears exactly one time in the entire Hebrew Bible, not twice, not as part of a recognizable pattern anyone can compare it against. Once. Think about what that means for translators working centuries later. When a word shows up dozens of times across a text, you can compare its uses and pin down its meaning with real confidence. When a word shows up once, you're working from a single data point, a locked door with only one key, and no way to check whether the key is even the right shape. It's a little like trying to work out the meaning of a word in an unfamiliar language from a single sentence where it appears. You can make a careful, reasonable guess from context. You can't cross-check it against anything else. That rarity is exactly why helel has generated centuries of argument among people doing honest, careful scholarship, not because the text is deliberately obscure, but because this is simply how rare words behave, and shining one wasn't the only idea carried by this phrase. The second half of it carries something even stranger. The Hebrew doesn't just call this figure shining one, it calls him son of shachar, son of dawn, and shachar isn't only a poetic word for morning in Isaiah's world. In the wider literature of the ancient Near East, preserved in texts recovered from the Canaanite city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, shachar is a recognized dawn deity paired with a twin brother, Shalim, the god of dusk. Together, ancient tradition understood them as the two faces of the planet Venus, the brilliant point of light that rises just before sunrise and the one that reappears just after sunset. This doesn't mean Isaiah is teaching Israelites to worship Canaanite gods. It means Isaiah's audience already carried a mental picture attached to this phrase, the same way a modern audience instantly pictures a specific story when you say, "The boy who cried wolf," without needing the whole fable explained first. Isaiah is borrowing a shape everyone in the room already recognized, a bright, ambitious figure tied to the morning star, rising gloriously before dawn, and then vanishing as the sun takes over. And that borrowed shape is about to be turned into a weapon aimed at Babylon. Because there's a specific myth behind that shape. In the Ugaritic texts recovered from Ras Shamra, scholars have identified a story involving the god Athtar, closely associated with the morning star, attempting to claim the throne of the storm god Baal after Baal's apparent death in the underworld. Athtar ascends the sacred mountain. He sits on the vacant throne, and he's found unable to fill it. His feet don't reach the footstool. He has to step back down, humiliated, to a lesser place. Isaiah 14 puts almost identical language in the mouth of its Babylonian king. I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly, in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Many scholars, and this connection is genuinely debated, not a settled fact either direction, see Isaiah reaching for a known myth about a minor god's failed grab for the highest throne, and repurposing it as an insult aimed squarely at a human king who made the very same mistake in miniature, reaching for a glory that was never his to hold. This isn't a passage inventing a new supernatural biography for anyone. It's a passage using a myth its audience already knew, a story of overreach and collapse, and pointing it, like a loaded word, straight at an empire that had humiliated Judah and was about to be humiliated in return. It's worth noticing, too, what word Isaiah does not use here. Just one chapter earlier, in Isaiah 13, the prophet describes the stars of heaven and their constellations using the ordinary Hebrew word for star, kokabim, as ordinary vocabulary for an ordinary astronomical picture, when chapter 14 reaches for helel. Instead, it's reaching past the plain word for star into something more loaded, more mythic, more specific. That shift in vocabulary, from chapter to chapter, is part of why so many scholars believe helel is doing more than simply describing brightness. It's summoning a character, a myth, a specific figure from the surrounding culture's imagination, and pinning that figure's fate onto a human king. And the poem doesn't stay in the sky for long. Once the boasting is finished, it comes back down to earth with a thud, and stays there. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms? A few lines later, the poem describes his corpse specifically, and it isn't gentle. Cast out of his tomb like a rejected branch, covered with the slain, trampled underfoot, denied burial among the kings who came before him. In the ancient world, that detail wasn't decoration. Denial of proper burial was one of the deepest humiliations a culture could describe, leaving the dead without honor, without rest, remembered only in disgrace. This is a passage lingering in its closing verses over a very specific, very human catastrophe, a dynasty ending, a name being erased, a body left unburied, not the biography of an angel, the obituary of a tyrant. There's a second passage worth placing beside this one, because it went through almost the identical journey. Ezekiel chapter 28 addresses the Prince of Tyre, again an explicitly human ruler, and then shifts into a lament for the king of Tyre, using imagery of Eden, of a guardian cherub, of a being who was blameless until iniquity was found in him and pride drove him out. Like Isaiah's poem, Ezekiel's lament was aimed at a real Mediterranean city-state and its real ruler, using cosmic, garden imagery as a literary device to describe the enormity of his pride and fall. And like Isaiah 14, later Christian readers eventually reinterpreted Ezekiel 28 as a description of Satan's primordial rebellion, sitting the two poems side by side as if they had always been telling one continuous, cosmic story. They hadn't. They were written independently, addressing separate historical situations, using a shared poetic vocabulary for describing a proud ruler's fall. But because both texts share the shape, glory, pride, a fall from a high place, they became, over time, twin pillars of a tradition neither text originally set out to build. There's even a geography hiding inside the boast itself, one easy to miss on a first reading. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly, in the far reaches of the north, is not a vague gesture toward the sky. In the wider mythology of the region, the far reaches of the north, Zaphon, in the Canaanite texts, was understood as the literal dwelling place of the gods, the mountain where the divine council met. Isaiah's Babylonian king isn't just boasting about generic glory, he's claiming, in language his contemporaries would have recognized instantly, a seat at the actual mountain of the gods. It's the same overreach Athtar attempts in the Ugaritic myth, reaching for the coordinates of divine assembly itself, not merely for abstract greatness. The parallel with Ezekiel is worth slowing down on a little further, because it shows this wasn't a one-time literary move. Ezekiel's lament over the king of Tyre describes him as having been in Eden, the garden of God, covered with precious stones, anointed as the guardian cherub, walking in the midst of the stones of fire, until unrighteousness was found in you, and pride over his own beauty and wisdom led to his expulsion. Read on its own, lifted out of its historical setting, that language sounds like it could only be describing a being who existed before the world began. Read inside its actual context, addressed explicitly to a Phoenician trading city and its ruler, it becomes something else, one of the most extravagant put-downs in the whole prophetic corpus, using cosmic imagery to say, in effect, you thought you belonged in paradise itself, and paradise has cast you out. Isaiah's Babylon and Ezekiel's Tyre are two separate cities, two separate rulers, two separate prophets, and yet both received almost the same treatment, dressed in almost the same mythic clothing. That repetition matters. It shows this kind of cosmic, garden and heaven imagery was simply how prophets of this period talked about the fall of the proudest kings they knew. It wasn't reserved for one unique cosmic villain. It was a genre convention used more than once, for more than one earthly tyrant. That's the imagery. Now for the harder question. How did a rare Hebrew word describing a Babylonian king's fall become a name for the devil? Centuries before Jerome ever touched this verse, Jewish scholars working in Alexandria had already translated the entire Hebrew Bible into Greek, a translation now known as the Septuagint, where the Hebrew has helel. The Septuagint uses the Greek word hiosphorus, dawn-bearer, or morning star. This Greek translation existed for centuries, with no connection whatsoever to Satan in the minds of its Greek-speaking Jewish and early Christian readers. It was simply understood as an astronomical image applied to a fallen tyrant, the same understanding the Hebrew carried. That matters, because it shows the plain, non-supernatural reading of this verse wasn't some fringe idea invented recently by skeptical scholars. It was the standard understanding in the most widely used translation of its era, long before Latin entered the picture at all, and long before anyone thought to attach it to a devil. Think about who was reading that Greek translation: Greek-speaking Jewish communities across the Mediterranean, and later, the earliest Greek-speaking Christians encountered this verse for generations through the word hiosphorus, a word carrying no more menace than morning star carries in English today. Whatever theological weight later attached itself to this passage, it did not arrive with the earliest translation of the text into another language. It arrived afterward, layered on by readers working in an entirely different linguistic and theological environment, centuries removed from the original audience Isaiah was addressing. Which brings us back, finally, to that cave in Bethlehem, and to the word Jerome chose next. By the time Jerome sits down to translate Isaiah into Latin in the closing years of the 4th century, morning star already has an obvious Latin equivalent, a word Roman poets and astronomers had used for generations to describe the planet Venus at dawn. Jerome renders helel as Lucifer, light-bearer, and he writes it exactly the way you'd write any ordinary descriptive word, lowercase, a common noun, not capitalized, not treated as anyone's personal name. It wasn't a theological leap. It wasn't an invention. It was the most natural, defensible translation choice available to him, matching a rare Hebrew word to the closest existing Latin term for the same astronomical image his readers already understood. This was not the moment Satan received his name. It was the moment an accurate translation of an obscure Hebrew word happened to use a term that would, centuries later, take on a life its translator never intended. So if Jerome didn't create Satan's name, who did? That's where the story leaves the biblical text completely and enters something far slower, the history of how Christians read. In the centuries after Jerome, church writers reading Isaiah 14 alongside two very different New Testament passages began to notice a resemblance. One was Jesus' statement in Luke's Gospel, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." The other was the later vision, in Revelation, of a great dragon being cast down out of heaven along with a third of the stars. Neither of these texts quotes Isaiah 14. Neither one references a Babylonian king or a rare Hebrew word for shining one, or a myth about Venus and a failed usurpation. They were written independently, addressing entirely different subjects, centuries apart from Isaiah and from each other. The fusion of these separate texts into one continuous storyline, a single narrative of Satan's pre-human rebellion, told partly through the language of Isaiah 14, happened gradually, through interpretation, not because any one text explicitly connects them. It's a little like three separate photographs, taken at different times, of entirely different scenes, that later got arranged together into a single photo album with one caption written underneath, connecting all three. The connection lives in the arrangement and the caption. It was never printed on the photographs themselves. By the time later readers reached Jerome's lowercase. Lucifer. They were already primed by that arrangement to see Satan in it, and once that reading took hold, it found its most vivid, unforgettable expression more than 1,000 years later, in an English epic poem, John Milton's Paradise Lost, published in 1667, which gave Lucifer a face, a voice, a motive, and a fully realized backstory that most modern readers now unconsciously treat as scriptural. Around the same period, the King James translators, working in 1611, inherited this already established tradition and rendered the verse, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning," capitalizing the word, the way a name is capitalized, cementing in English what centuries of interpretation had already assumed. It's worth pausing on just how much cultural weight Milton's poem alone carries in this story. Paradise Lost gives its Lucifer speeches, motives, a council of fallen angels, a war fought and lost before the world began, none of which comes from Isaiah 14, and almost none of which comes from any single biblical text at all. It's a magnificent work of literature, drawing on centuries of accumulated Christian tradition, Jewish apocalyptic writing, and Milton's own theological imagination. But its vividness is exactly why so many readers today experience the mental image of Lucifer's fall as something they remember reading in the Bible, when what they actually remember is a 17th century English epic poem quoting a phrase from a 4th century Latin translation of a rare 8th century BC Hebrew word. Each layer is real. None of the layers, taken alone, is Scripture handing us Satan's name. By that point, Lucifer had stopped being a translation of a Hebrew adjective. It had become, in the popular imagination, a name, which means the real story here isn't that the church invented a name out of nothing, maliciously or carelessly. It's that a word describing a Babylonian king's stolen glory slowly borrowed an identity it was never originally carrying. One century, one writer, one retelling, one translation choice at a time. That's already a great deal to sit with. A rare Hebrew word, a Babylonian king, mocked in a taunt song his own contemporaries would have recognized instantly. A Greek translation that stood for centuries without controversy, a Latin word for a planet, written in lowercase by a careful translator in a cave. If this is the first time you've seen this passage taken apart word by word, instead of simply assumed, that's exactly the kind of layer this channel exists to uncover. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper like this, and drop a comment with what surprised you most so far, because the next layer changes the picture again. There's a detail we haven't touched yet, and it's the one that turns this from an interesting translation history into something genuinely unsettling. This exact title, Morning Star, doesn't only appear once in the Bible. Go looking for it anywhere else in Scripture, and you don't have to search long. It surfaces again, at the very end of the Bible, in its final chapter, in words attributed directly to Jesus. Revelation 22, verse 16. I am the root and the offspring of David, and the bright and morning star. The same image, bright, rising before the dawn, associated with glory and ascent, used by Christ to describe himself, in the closing lines of the entire biblical canon. Now hold that next to what tradition has done with Isaiah 14. If Lucifer, son of the morning, is understood as Satan's original identity, the name of his glory before the fall, then Christ, in the Bible's final words, appears to reach for that very same title. That's the detail almost no one notices on a casual reading, not because it's hidden, but because by the time most readers get to Revelation, morning star has already been mentally filed away as Satan's word, and the brain simply doesn't flag the repetition. Here's what's actually happening, and it's worth being careful about. Morning star isn't a name owned by one figure in Scripture. It's an image, tied to the planet Venus, used at different points for different purposes: majesty, brightness, the promise of a new day. Isaiah's helel uses that image to describe a king's fall. Revelation uses a related image to describe Christ's rightful glory. These are two separate texts doing two different things, connected by a shared astronomical picture, not a shared identity. But that's precisely what makes the echo so striking. A title assumed, by long tradition, to belong permanently to the devil is, at the close of the New Testament, spoken by Jesus about himself, with no hint of confusion, no need to clarify, no sense that the word had already been claimed by someone else. Which brings the whole investigation back to where it started. Lucifer was never a name written into the Hebrew Bible for Satan. It was a word, rare, borrowed from a shared ancient mythic vocabulary, accurately translated by careful hands, describing a king's fall from glory. Over centuries of reading, retelling, and reimagining, that word slowly gathered an identity of its own, until morning star and Satan felt inseparable in the popular mind. But Scripture itself never fully closed that door. At the very end of the story, the same title still belongs, without contradiction, to someone else entirely. That's not a contradiction in the Bible. It's a signal that the name we inherited was built, carefully and gradually, by real people making real translation choices, layer by layer, long after the ink on Isaiah's scroll had dried. A cave in Bethlehem, a scholar and a lamp. A poem, older still, sung by a people who had just watched an empire fall, an empire that had once watched them fall first. A king, never named beyond king of Babylon, dressed for a moment in the borrowed light of a myth about a god who reached for a throne that was never his. A word, used once. Shining One, Son of Dawn, carried into Greek by translators who saw a planet, not a devil. Carried into Latin by a man who saw the same planet and reached for the nearest word that already existed. Lowercase, ordinary, accurate, and then for a long while, nothing happens to it at all. Centuries pass. The word sits quietly inside a translated verse, doing exactly what it was translated to do. It's the readers who move, slowly, one generation at a time, placing a New Testament vision of Satan falling like lightning beside an old poem about a Babylonian king falling from glory. Noticing the resemblance, trusting the resemblance. Retelling it until the resemblance became, in the minds of readers 1,000 years removed from Isaiah, something very close to a record. By the time Milton picked up his pen, Lucifer wasn't a translation anymore. It was a character, a history, a face. None of that happened in the Hebrew. All of it happened after. A king lost his throne in the 8th century before Christ. A name was born from that loss more than 1,000 years later, and it was never his. Every hand that touched this word along the way, the poet, the Greek translator, Jerome in his cave, the King James scholars, Milton at his desk, was doing careful, faithful, or at least well-intentioned work. And somewhere in the accumulation of all that careful work, an identity formed that none of them, individually, set out to create. There's something quietly familiar in all of this, if you sit with it long enough. A word, accurate, careful, well-intentioned, passed from one hand to another. And somewhere in the passing, it stopped meaning what it first meant. It started carrying more than it was ever given to carry, until the word and the story people told about it became almost impossible to separate. That happens to people too. A reputation forms the same way a translation drifts, not all at once, not from a single lie, but from 100 small retellings, each one slightly less careful than the last, each one trusting the version that came before it, instead of going back to the source. Most of us are carrying at least one identity we didn't choose, something said about us once, repeated, believed, until it hardened into who we are, even when it was never quite true, or never the whole truth. Even the mechanics of how this happened deserve a moment of sympathy, rather than suspicion. No single church council decided, in one sitting, to rename Satan. No forger inserted the word into the text. Ordinary readers, doing what ordinary readers of Scripture have always done, tried to make sense of one difficult passage by placing it next to another that seemed to rhyme with it. That's not a scandal. It's how interpretation has always worked, for better and for worse. Texts read in light of other texts, generation after generation, until a reading becomes so familiar it feels like it was always there. The honest response isn't outrage at earlier readers. It's simply going back, carefully, to see what the original words were actually doing before that long process of layering began. And there's something else worth sitting with. Quieter still. The king in Isaiah's poem reached for a glory that was never his. I will ascend, I will make myself like the Most High. And the poem's entire argument is that this kind of reaching ends in a fall. But at the far end of Scripture, the title, Morning Star, belongs to someone who never had to reach for it. It was already his. He didn't seize it, he simply said it, plainly, about himself. Two ways of holding the same brightness. One grasping, one given. Isaiah's poem was never really about where a name came from. It was about what happens when glory is taken instead of received. That's not a new temptation. It's one of the oldest in Scripture, and one of the most familiar in an ordinary life. The pull to grab hold of an identity, a status, a version of yourself, before it's actually yours to hold. It shows up in smaller ways than a king's throne. In the version of ourselves we perform before we've actually become it. In the reputation we grasp at, instead of the quieter, slower work of simply becoming trustworthy. In the way it's tempting to announce a glory rather than let it be recognized. Isaiah's poem doesn't condemn brightness itself. The same image, after all, belongs rightly to Christ at the end of the story. It condemns brightness that reaches beyond its place, brightness that has to announce itself, brightness that can't wait to be given. The story underneath the story of Lucifer isn't really about Satan's name at all. It's about the difference between a glory that's seized and a glory that's simply, quietly, already true. The name we feared was never spoken over him. It was written about a king, translated by a careful hand, and only later, slowly, borrowed by the rest of us to explain a darkness the original words never claimed to hold. A translator's careful lowercase word, a king who is never named again in history outside a taunt song written about his fall, a title borrowed by tradition, and a title claimed openly, without contradiction, by Christ himself at the very end of the story. Somewhere between those two claims on the same brightness is the whole of what this passage was actually trying to say. If this is the kind of digging that makes Scripture feel alive again instead of assumed, that's what the Scripture Project is for. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper like this. Send this one to someone who's only ever heard the familiar version. And if a passage like this stays with you after the video ends, say so in the comments. Those conversations are half the reason this channel exists.